Okay, so welcome again to another ENVITER webinar. So we are recording this webinar, and in a few days you will be able also to check it out in ENVITER YouTube channel. So today we are going to listen to Mrs. Laura Latour talking about autism spectrum disorders in visual impairment. Okay, so I give the floor to Laura.
Okay, thank you very much. So yeah, my name is Laura Latour. I'm a psychologist. I work in Lyon in France, and I mainly work with autistic people, children, adolescents, and young adults. And today I'm going to present to you some information that I gathered together when I was working on my PhD, which was on this theme. So in looking at autism in very young, visually impaired or blind children. And so I'm going to start with... Can everybody hear okay? Hopefully. And so I'm just going to start by looking back at some of the things that I found in the research that I looked at, and then I will present to you quite quickly the study that I did for my PhD and some of the results that came out of that study. This is the presentation that I did to the group who were present in Vienna a few weeks ago. So anybody who was in Vienna are going to be really bored because it's the exact same thing. So here we go. I'm just going to try and share my screen with you. I remember how to do that.
You have on the bottom,
yeah,
a share screen or partiller, something?
Yeah, I think I've got
yes.
it.
And now you have to choose. Yeah, that's it. Press F5 or put the presentation on.
Yeah.
On the bottom right. Yeah.
Okay. So hopefully everyone can see the slides now.
Perfect.
Yeah. Okay. Let me just move. I just need to move that out of the way. Okay. So basically, the context in which I started becoming interested in this subject is when I was working in visual impairment and with very young children who were showing lots of signs that looked like a lot like autism. And I'm sure that many of you will be familiar with this situation. And when the families were asking about getting a diagnosis and going to the services, the diagnosis services for autism, they were getting a lot of refusal because the services were saying, oh, we don't really know how to diagnose autism when the child has visual impairment. And so that is something that's been going on obviously for a long time. And a few years ago in Lyon and the Lyon area, we started a network to try and address this problem. And so we put together some study groups on it. And within this group, this network, there were obviously special needs services and also autism diagnosis services and some other services. Some people are more specialized in autism, some people are more specialized in visual impairment. And so the idea was to really get together and to ask questions together to see how we could work together to get a reliable diagnosis of autism in visually impaired children. So that was our local network in the Rhône area of France. Since then, there's also a national network who studies the same similar kind of question. That's organized by the team in Los-les-Lilles, who have a really great network all over France, and who organize loads of conferences and things. It's really interesting things going on. And so basically the work of this network, it started from the two ideas that in research, we can see that there's a very high prevalence of autism spectrum disorders in blind and severely visually impaired children. Some studies estimate that there might be up to 50% of these children who have some kind of autism. Some studies say even more. And in our clinical observations, obviously, what I just said, that diagnosis of autism is very complex to make. There's a lot of overlapping of clinical signs and not many tests that are adapted to doing a reliable diagnosis. Okay, so that's where it all started. Why can I not make this change? Right. So what we're going to look at today is just go through which characteristics may be more specific to the development of visually impaired children. So when a child is born or has in a very young age a visual impairment, what kind of things are we going to see? How is that going to change their development? So that's the first thing that I looked at in my research, and that's the first thing that I'm going to present to you today. And then once I've said those things, I'm going to try and show how those things may link to autism, or at least something that looks like autism. I'm going to go through different developmental trajectories that are mentioned in the research for children with visual impairment, and go back to this symptom overlap and a difficulty in reliably identifying autism in visually impaired children. And then I'm just going to present to you the small study that I did on this topic, and then at the very end, just go through a list of current questions that many of us are still asking ourselves, and talk to you about what we, the IFSAM in France, would like to propose to the ENVITER network. Okay. So many aspects of development are going to be affected by a child having severe visual impairment or blindness during the early years. So for some areas of development, we're going to see delays. For other areas of development, then there will be more of an atypical development with different kind of characteristics. So I've listed some of the things here. So motor delays, stereotypic movements, differences in the way that the child's going to communicate non-verbally and verbally, some delays or differences in the verbal language, some differences or atypical play behaviors, and then in social interactions, maybe some difficulties or some differences in the way that the child is going to react. So if we look at each of those, so first of all, to do with the motor development, then if you look at in the research, different things that I mentioned are that there's very little spontaneous exploration of the environment in the first 2 years. There's going to be a delay in the child using the seated position independently. So everything is going to be a little bit later. Difficulties changing positions. So children that sometimes the visually impaired babies can be described as just, you know, too good, you put them down, they'll stay still, they won't necessarily be exploring their environment just quite as much. Please, you just excuse me for 1 second. I'm just going to turn off my microphone for 1 second. Excuse me. Sorry, just one of my children having a crisis. So we were looking at motor development. And a lot of the things that in motor development are typically going to happen later. I mean, when you look at the research, it does change a little bit because the research from the 1970s, 1980s shows a greater delay than more recent research. Obviously, the techniques for intervention with young children do have an effect now, and obviously things are getting more and more. So that there is less delays these days than there was in the 1970s. Children are more stimulated now in a different way. But there is always going to be a little bit of delay in walking, in sitting, etc. And one of the other things which is going to be delayed is object permanence. But again, there is within this a really massive variability between one child and another. So it really is quite variable. It's difficult to generalize. Okay. Oops. Sorry. I'm not sure if you can see that because I can't. Right. So the second aspect was to do with stereotypic movements, or what we may call blindisms. So a lot of visually impaired people, a lot of visually impaired young children do display some kind of stereotypic movements. Some of the research suggests that almost all individuals with a severe visual impairment will display at least one form of stereotypic movement, which is probably some kind of functional sensory stimulation to adapt to the lack of visual input, to harmonize the sensory experience. One of the things that's mentioned quite often is eye pressing. So children will typically do a lot of that kind of stimulation, pressing on the eyeball. Another type of blindism that's quite often mentioned is rocking. So children that will be rocking back and forth. This seems to happen more often in some kinds of high-risk situations when there's a lack of stimulation or a stressful environment. Looking towards non-verbal communication, what we find in the research is that a child with visual impairment is typically going to have a completely different set of non-verbal communications. So there'll be quite unusual signs. A child that may be more concentrated on something will become tend to become still or lowering their head to concentrate on auditory information. Obviously, when the parents are not used to that, then they might take it as the child switching off or the child being in a bubble, etc., etc. Whereas it's actually the child's way of concentrating more and attending more to the auditory information. Again, a child may show different and original signals to attract other people's attention. Whereas with a sighted child, you'd expect eye contact and pointing and reaching. A blind child or a visually impaired child will find different ways to attract people's attention. Again, obviously linked to that, there's going to be a lack of pointing and lack of hand gestures in general. Typically, there'll be less facial expressions also, and children with a visual impairment are typically going to have much more difficulty in interpreting other people's emotional expressions for obvious reasons. We carry on now to language and atypical verbal communication. We can see the research that a lot of the visually impaired children, especially young children, will tend to have less frequent social initiatives. So they'll be less vocal, basically. They'll be less likely to use their speech in social situations. And there will be some differences in pragmatic language, like pronoun inversion, a phase of echolalia that may be longer than in a typically developing child. The kind of inappropriate, well, say inappropriate, so I suppose that's not very positive, but inappropriate use of questions or different use of questions. What we might call egocentric language, the child's language will tend to be geared towards expressing their own needs or things that are to do with themselves and their own experience. And a later use of the word I. So that's small differences in language development. Some research suggests that although visually impaired children will have slower and more progressive development of language, they do often tend to catch up when they get to kind of school age, 4 or 5. They seem to take an alternative pathway and somehow kind of get to the same place as the others in the end by the time they're at school age. One of the things that is mentioned in the research to do with verbal skills is that verbal language and the development of competency in verbal language is actually really important to compensate for other difficulties that are linked to the visual impairment or blindness. And we'll see later on how that's important to for autism traits as well. And visually impaired children tend to have some challenges linked to the perception of sensory information, and there's not very much research about this. There's some clinical observations, and so things that are mentioned in different clinical observations is that small visually impaired children will tend to be quite fearsome of certain sounds, especially if sudden noises or noises that are out of the child's control. They may tend to have taste sensitivities or have trouble accepting new textures in food. There may be a certain amount of sensory seeking, especially for vestibular stimulation or auditory, and there may be a kind of aversion to touch certain objects, certain textures, especially things that are cold or soft or sticky. It depends on the child, but I mean, this is really just clinical descriptions, and it's not something that's been and not in any of the research that I found anyway. Maybe it has clinical sense. And around the play behaviors of these children, there tend to be some atypical play behaviors. So, as I said, babies may be considered as sort of too calm. They may show less play activity, less exploration of their environment. They may want to be in a more solitary, repetitive play, or in something kind of very sensory kind of play, like to a later stage than a child who can see. And there tends to be less symbolic play, less pretend play. And visually impaired children tend to be less interested in group games. And one of the things that's mentioned in the research about that is that group games often just tend to go really too fast for visually impaired children, and they sort of can't keep up because they haven't got all the information, so it's harder for them to keep up with the just the pure speed of the game, the way it's going. And so in those kind of situations, they tend to step back and head to a more solitary play. So just carrying on. And some difficulties are noted in the research to do with social interactions. So there is less frequent joint attention. I mean, obviously to do with that, we know that joint attention doesn't look the same with a visually impaired child than with a child who can see. But even taking that into account, it seems that there is less frequent joint attention with visually impaired children, young children. There tends to be a delay in understanding and correctly answering in false belief tests. So these visually impaired children tend to develop the theory, spelling mistake there, a theory of mind that tends to develop quite a bit later in visually impaired children. And there seems to be what is observed is a kind of rigidity in social interactions and emotional withdrawal, and a difficulty integrating with peer groups, which is probably linked also to one of the things that I mentioned about everything going a bit too fast, and also the difficulty to understand some of the social cues when you haven't got the visual information. So that's some of the things that are observed in early years. So if we look now at autism spectrum disorder, so just need to move that. So obviously in the latest versions of DSM-5 and the ICD-11, the diagnosis of autism is now autism spectrum disorders. So on that, we have what we call a dyad of symptoms. So we've got two main groups of symptoms. To have a diagnosis of ASD, we need to be able to see qualitative alterations of social communication. So that's communication, verbal and non-verbal communication, language and social interaction, and everything that goes with it. So that's one group of symptoms. The second group of symptoms is the repetitive and restricted interests and behaviors. So all of the children who are diagnosed with ASD need to show that they have certain objects, certain subjects that they're really very interested in, and these subjects take up a lot of their time and a lot of their mental space. And linked to that is now included in diagnosis an unusual sensitivity to sensory information. So we are talking about a spectrum of difficulties. So for each of those different symptoms, we will be able to observe it at more or less intensive, with more or less intensity. The autism spectrum disorder can be diagnosed with different intensities, so at different levels, depending on the amount of help and the amount of support the individual will need to get on to be independent in their own life and to interact with other people. And it can be comorbid with a learning disability or not. So the profiles of people with ASD are quite variable, depending on the different profile. So if we look now at, we've looked at how a visual impairment affects early development, and then we've looked at what autism is and how to diagnose it really quickly. And so if we look now at, for example, the MCHAT-R, which is like an early screening tool for ASD. So it's typically it's a really fast screening tool that maybe a family doctor can use. Just they'll just ask a series of questions to the parents, and it's tick 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 tick. And so this is the list of things that will be asked in the MCHAT-R. And basically I've highlighted in pink all of the things that will be affected by a child having a visual impairment in the early years. The MCHAT-R is basically for children between 16 to 30 months. So we are within the second and third year of life. And so obviously all the things in pink will probably be ticked when a child has a visual impairment. So obviously visual joint attention will be affected. Response to name call, as I said, children with a visual impairment might tend to look down or stop when when their name is called, rather than turn around and look at the person who called them. Pointing, showing, and social smiling, reacting to other people smiling, things like that. Eye contact, interest towards peers, imitation, and seeking attention, as well as symbolically. So all of these things are going to get a tick for the visually impaired children. And so that's why it's a bit complicated when they are small to get to pick up which children are actually at risk of developing autism and which children are just going through their normal development as a visually impaired child. So if we look at the combination of visual impairment and autism spectrum disorders, basically it's not a new topic at all. When I did my PhD, I had lots of fun finding loads of really old texts that actually already were talking about these kind of things. So in 1749, we've got a text from Diderot who talks about blind people and talks about delays in language, delays in cognitive ability, and what he called at that time absence of emotion. And then in the early 1900s, some of these terms are quite shocking, but I think you have to replace them in the historical context. Villi warns parents of blind children against over-assisting their children, so as to avoid them developing selfish and ungrateful attitudes. French in the 30s already observed quite a lot of sensory seeking in blind children and obsessions, strong interest for something. And then other authors talk about emotional instability, lack of appropriate emotional facial expressions, difficulty establishing emotional relationships, and Henry in 58 talks about what he calls emotional withdrawal. And then from the 50s onwards, we've got quite a lot of more modern type studies who all tend to talk about autism-like troubles, like Keeler and many others at that time. And obviously, there's since then there's been lots and lots of research done into this. And so now in 2005, there was a book of a collection of articles that came out, edited by Linda Pring, which is always interesting to read, literature review. And then just listed quite a few of the more recent ones. Everybody seems to be asking themselves the same kinds of questions, and that's one of the reasons why why I wanted to work on this question for my PhD, and why we want to carry on working on it. And it's really like, how can we figure out the difference between what's actually autism, or what looks like autism, what's linked to visual impairment, what's not linked to visual impairment but would have been there anyway. It's all these same kinds of questions. So, visual impairment and autism. What does the research say? Why is this not coming up? There you go. So, quite a few of the research studies are based around what we might call autistic traits in blind or visually impaired individuals. So I mentioned earlier the studies into motor stereotypies and blindisms. So there's quite a few studies that are based around that. So we've kind of established that in a visually impaired population, there's going to be quite a lot of stereotypies and blindisms and whatever you want to call it. So that's one aspect. The next aspect concerns verbal communication characteristics. So as we mentioned earlier, like repetitive questioning or unusual questioning or language delays and things like that. Another group of the research papers are to do with the atypical repetitive play. So we've seen some of that. So children who might be less likely to be into symbolic play, or acting out things with little people and things, but more into just pure sensory play. And another group of the research papers are to do with difficulties in social interactions. So those are the four main themes that come out of the different research papers. And the papers that talk about children who really meet the diagnostic criteria for the full ASD syndrome tend to be quite varied as well in what they find. And you can see that depending on which research paper you read, they suggest that ASD in the visually impaired population is from 1% up to 72%. And so it's really quite variable. But some of these variations can be explained when you look at the research groups that they were looking at. The Jur paper from 2016, for example, would have been a study of one particular group of children with a particular genetic syndrome. So I think what's interesting to look at is that there's quite a few of the studies that suggest that autism spectrum disorder seems to be at approximately a 30 to 50% prevalence in the visually impaired population. And there's kind of a few different studies that seem to come to that conclusion, which is obviously quite a lot more than in the general population, which is about 1.5. Some of the studies suggest that actually what we can see is something that's autism-like, but maybe slightly different, maybe even temporary. Pry in 2014 suggests that actually multiple developmental delays in language, motor skills, and social skills just kind of mime autism spectrum disorder in visually impaired children. And it's actually what you can see looks the same, but it's not doesn't come from the same place. Brown suggested that there's probably some qualitative differences in the ASD symptoms. Brown suggested that there's probably quite a lot more stereotype behavior and motor repetitive behavior, and quite a lot less of the social type of symptoms. And in visually impaired children, you might see quite a bit more social curiosity than in children who can't see and have autism. Hobson and Lee suggested that in quite a few children, or in the group of children that they studied, there was some symptom diminution or some kind of recovery from autism spectrum disorders in later childhood, so going into the teenage years. The same, they studied a group during childhood and then into their teenage years, and quite a few of these children seem to compensate by developing better language skills and not be classed as autistic at that second time of being studied. Some authors suggest that, as I said, language seems to be really important for compensation and finding a different way to be in social interactions, and using really the language to understand the world in a different way. Baron-Cohen suggests that what we are observing may just be superficial similarities, and Perez-Pereira and Conti-Ramsden say that a behavior which appears identical may have a different function for a blind child and for a sighted autistic child. So some authors are suggesting that what we can see looks the same, but it might not be exactly the same, and it might not have the same function. Other authors are saying, well, yeah, there might be some differences, but we can actually come up with some real qualitative differences between a child who is just visually impaired and a child who is visually impaired with ASD. And again, there's very little concrete research and results that prove this, and there's quite a few books and articles that are clinical observations, which are interesting to look at on this point. And I've just put there in a table, I've just compiled different things that come out of these three different clinical observations. And for example, in language, what the authors are saying is that a visually impaired child with autism will typically have very little verbal language, a long period of echolalia, very little interest for verbal input, and not much interaction through language. And if they do speak, they will tend to have quite repetitive themes. whereas a visually impaired child without autism at the same age will tend to, they'll have an echolalia phase, but it'll be much shorter, and they'll show much more pleasure in the verbal interactions, and they will really show a kind of explosion of language in the first few years and have a wide vocabulary and really use that language in social situations. So that's they say that's like a real observed difference, and to do with interaction, social interactions. Sorry, I didn't translate that. A child with autism and visual impairment will tend to have less interest in social interactions and be less sharing with other people when they're playing, and less showing, less sharing, and tend to want to be in solitary play and less social engagement. And whereas a visually impaired child without any autism will tend to be really socially curious, ask loads of questions, share their emotions, their thoughts, share their ideas, and things like that. So this is people who work with visually impaired children at a young age, just saying, okay, they've all got some kind of things that look a little bit like autism, but there's a real big difference between a child that has a real autism spectrum disorder or real difficulties in social communication, and a visually impaired child who's just growing up with a visual impairment. So what seems to come out of this is that there's probably multiple and multifactorial genetic, environmental, heterogeneous pathogenesis. And there's, as with ASD in general, and there's in quite a few articles that suggest that for autism spectrum disorder in general, there's one syndrome but many etiologies. And so in the case of visual impairment, it seems that social communication disorder can be a direct consequence of the absence of visual input and the resulting difficulties in establishing relational synchrony. And that will obviously really depend also on what kind of help the child has when they're really little, what kind of teams they've got around them, what kind of teams they've got around their family to help them to adapt to having a visually impaired child. The second aspect there is that there can be comorbid neurological lesions or a genetic syndrome which affect both the vision and social communication and language. So there are a specific part of the brain that's going to be affected by a genetic syndrome or another reason, which will give to see both a visual impairment and autism. And the last aspect there, the combination of total congenital blindness, a neurological susceptibility, and fragile social emotional context. So obviously, as with most things, we're in a situation where there'll be a neurological susceptibility, and then it's really like the environmental, the situation in which the child grows up, which is going to obviously have an effect on the way that expresses itself. So if we look at the developmental trajectories of visually impaired children, we can see in the research that often we'll have a kind of typical development in the first year, bearing in mind that obviously parents they've just discovered that they've got a visually impaired child, that there's going to be quite a bit of getting used to that as well and adapting to that situation. And there tends to be a critical period during the middle to the end of the second year, where there's 3 risk groups. This is the team of Sunkson and Dale and Salt, and the team in London that have done a lot of work about this. So obviously there's one group where there's a clear regression in language and social skills, and that's what they call the developmental setback group. So yeah, the child seems to be developing normally. They seem to be starting to show their first speak, their first sounds, their first words, and to be interested in social situations to a certain extent. And then middle to end of second year, they seem to lose that, and then seem to either just stagnate or regress. Another group in orange there seem to show some kind of uneven development with a few autistic traits. And then a third risk group in green there, children who have good communication but tend to have quite a bit of rigid behavior and with poor flexibility. And then during childhood and adolescence, there are two different trajectories that are observed. So either the child will manage to compensate, either they develop good language skills, or they just get a lot better at the social communication skills. At least partially, things will get better and autism symptoms decline. The second trajectory will be more of like an installation of that clinical picture, where the child will really stay, be quite disabled by these social communication difficulties that they have, and that will continue during childhood and adolescence, and so either persists or even maybe worsens in some children. So obviously the problem here is how to detect during early childhood which children are going to be at risk of developing severe social communication disorders. So as we said, like when during the first few years, it's a lot of the children are going to show a lot of the kind of autistic traits. How do you detect which ones are going to manage to compensate and which children are going to stay in difficulty with this autism? And that's going to determine, for people who are working with these families and these children, that's going to determine the level of impact of these disorders on the child's development, on their future independence, on the quality of life of that child and their family. So it's obviously really important for early years teens, and it's also going to help the teams to adapt the type and the intensity of the different services offered to children and families. So it's an important thing to be able to figure out. So there's actually two problems within that. So first one, obviously the difficulty in getting a valid standardized assessment of any deviation from the norm in development compared to, in the population of visually impaired children. So there's not that many tests available right now. And the second is this, what we've been talking about, the overlap in clinical symptoms, which makes diagnosis of ASD difficult in the blind or visually impaired child. So there's these two things. So the first one, difficulty in actually having a standardized assessment of development to see, is this child behind in this domain or in this domain of development. There's a lack of specialized assessment tools for visually impaired children. There's obviously a huge heterogeneity of the visually impaired population, with level of visual impairment, the etiology, and that can have a big effect on the variability of that population. So that probably also explains the lack of tests as well, because tests are hard to create, and they're hard to get standardized. And so one of the only tests that we're aware of and as far as I know, is still used in some services, is the Reynolds-Incan developmental scales for young visually handicapped children, which, as you can tell by the cover of the book, is quite an old scale. So it's from the 1970s. 1979, it was edited and standardized on a group of British children. It's an interesting scale to use because it has been created specifically for the visually impaired children, age 2 to 6. There's two scales, one for blind children, one for visually impaired, so two sample groups. And it tests the children in 6 areas of development: playing, exploration, motor, cognitive, language, and social skills. A thing that for us, it's a bit complicated. It's not translated into French, but it exists in English, obviously, with sample groups of Brits. And it has, I believe, been translated into Dutch, and the sample was revised in 2000 with a sample in the Netherlands. There's a couple of things in progress in France. So the first one, there's a project to establish a new scale for testing development of visually impaired children, the project EVAL-DV, which is led by the network, the Réseau TSR. So it's our local network. So we've been working on that for quite a few years. Using different other scales, the Reynolds-Incan being one of them, to try and come up with a new scale, which is a bit more detailed than Reynolds-Incan, to try and establish developmental delay or developmental difficulties in visually impaired children. The other project I wanted to mention was happening in the north of France is the project Gros Jedi, which is run by the GAPAS in Lille, and that's another kind of scale which it's for young visually impaired children, and it's a direct observation using toy situation, presenting toys and play situation to test the children's different skills in different areas, and the aim is to better adapt the interventions and the aims for that child. So the second problem is the overlap in clinical symptoms, which makes diagnosis of ASD difficult in the blind or visually impaired child. Obviously, there are two risks. One of them is overdiagnosis. So because the clinical signs are quite similar, ASD, autism can be seen in almost all of blind or severely visually impaired children due to developmental differences. It's almost like as if they say they've all got autism, and that's especially true at a young age. The other risk is obviously the opposite, so diagnostic masking. So the autism teams might, be more to say, well, autism spectrum disorders are obscured by pre-existing visual impairment, and be seen more of a consequence of a visual impairment that will just pass as the child grows up. So it's sort of like saying it's not really real autism, it's something else. And so that's why it's just really important to have reliable information for clinical decision making. So I'm just going to quickly talk about the study that I did a few years ago. So the research question that I was studying is, can we retrospectively identify at a very young age, so 12 months to 48 months, observable signs of autism disorder in visually impaired children who are later diagnosed with ASD? So basically what I did was to take home videos of children who were diagnosed with autism, to take home videos of children who had no autism, just a normal development, and to go back and look at those home videos when the children were very small, and to see if we could see any differences at that age. So the hypotheses were, first of all, that there will be observable early differences in the levels of social communication, so less joint attention, less social interest, less shared fun, less social engagement. And the second main hypothesis was that signs of early autism in early infancy will be specific and clinically different to behaviours linked to adaptations to visual impairment. So it basically it's not just the visual impairment that's showing it, but there will be a real difference. So less play, more stereotypies, more sensory sensitivities, atypical language, and repetitive movement. So as I said, the methodology that I used was, oops, sorry. So methodology, I obviously, as with a lot of studies into visually impaired children, I was working with a very small sample group. So I had 14 films. I think I had 6 different children, if I remember rightly. So 14 films that were studied. Each film was 180 seconds. The films were made up of situations which involved play and interaction. So the film, in all of the films that were chosen, the child was in the film with another person, either a parent, another adult, or a sibling. The film, so in the film sequences that I studied, there was 4 films for children aged 12 months, 6 films at 24 months, and 4 films at 3 to 4 years. And they were analysed with an online behavioural analysis program called Boris. In the categories of behaviours that we observed were the following: motor skills, social communication and interaction, joint attention, play behaviours, repetitive behaviours, sensory sensitivities, and language and vocalization. So that's what Boris looks like. So the video plays, this is just a stock picture, this is not actual video. So the video plays in the middle, and the observers click for each behavior. So we watched the video for one time for each behavior that we were studying. And so we click when we saw it. Or for some behaviors, we click the start and we click the end. So the behaviors were coded by 2 observers, the second being unaware of the child's pathology or group. And we had quite a decent interjudge fidelity. So the results of this, obviously with such a small group, there's not that much statistical work that you can do. So there were descriptive statistics and a few inferential statistics, transform data with a student t-test. So obviously we're in, it's more of a pilot study than anything else. It's such a small sample that we're only looking really at finding tendencies. Obviously the statistics have no strength whatsoever. There's no generalization possible because it's such a small group. But some of the tendencies that come out of it were, I think, were pretty interesting. So first of all, looking at joint attention and shared fun in social interactions, there were some differences observed, but there was such a huge variability between subjects that these could not really be taken into account in the results. Some other aspects provided clear differences that were observed between the 2 groups as early as 12 or 24 months, and different trajectories between the 2 groups. So the first one is social communication and interactions. So we can see that in the green group is the visually impaired group without autism, with no diagnosis of autism. The blue group is the children with ASD and visual impairment. So you can see that even as early as 12 months, the social communication behaviors that we were looking at and the social interaction behaviors that we were observing, the frequency, are much less frequent in the group of children who were diagnosed later on with ASD. So as early as 12 months, and that's a tendency that continued through the 3 age groups that we studied. So there was in all of the videos basically that we observed, there was quite a big difference between the amount of social communication behaviors that were observed in the 2 groups. The second aspect is the social seeking behaviors. So, starting an interaction with someone else, asking a question, opening up, pointing, going to pulling on someone to ask something. So again, the social seeking behaviors tended to be much more frequent in the children with no diagnosis of ASD. And the third aspect is functional verbal language. So using words, using verbal communication to establish contact with somebody else, or to ask a question, or to describe something. There's not very much difference at 12 months. So there's not very much language at all, really, at 12 months in either group. And then at 24 months, it tends to be a kind of language explosion in the group of children with no ASD, and which is not observed particularly in the group of children who were later diagnosed with ASD. So they do make some progress in functional verbal language, but it's much less marked than the children who do not have ASD. So that's quite a big difference. And at 24 months, it's especially obvious this difference. So some behaviors were seemingly not distinct before the age of 3. So repetitive echolalic language, again, at 12 months, we had not much language anyway. So there was none in either. At 24 months, it's actually interesting affected that there's actually more repetitive echolalic language in the group of children with visual impairment and no autism. So that's they were in an echolalia phase here. And at 3 to 4 years, there is no more echolalia observed in that group, in the visual group with no ASD. And however, in the ASD group, there's there's a much more frequent observation of echolalic language at age 3. In repetitive behavior, so motor repetitive behavior or verbal, we can see that again, before the age of 3, there's not much difference in these. So at 12 months, both groups show some repetitive behavior. The visual impairment with no ASD a little bit more. 24 months, it's quite similar. And there's a similar kind of effect with echolalia. At the age of between 3 and 4, we see that there's a lot of repetitive behavior, a lot more repetitive behavior in the children with ASD, and it tends to stay quite stable in the children without ASD. But some aspects were observed, especially or only in the ASD group, which seem interesting for differential diagnosis. Let me just turn that off. The first one is the amount of time spent in non-social sensory play. So for that, there were a few children that we saw that were spend a lot of the play that we observed was just sensory, without any observable sharing with anybody else. And so that was quite marked, that in all 3 age groups, there was a lot of non-social sensory play in the group of children with ASD, and there was some, but less, and less and less in the group of children with visual impairment without autism. So that seems to be something that might be interesting to look at. Another behavior is rejecting an adult or a peer's offer of play. So if somebody comes and offers to give a toy or to do something to play with the child and they don't react, or that they push the person away, that was one of the things that we noted there, and that was only observed in the videos of the children with ASD. Oops, and the other one. Oops. Sorry. And the last one was unusual sensory responses. Either be startled by sensory information or trying to search for sensory information, looking for sensory input. So that was, again, something that was only observed in the ASD group. Some things that seem to be really poor discriminators under the age of 3 are, real symptom overlap between just visual impairment and autism with visual impairment. This list of things seems to be quite poor discriminators when they're very small. So stereotypical movements, absence of response to name, poor imagination, absence of pointing, echolalia, things like that. So that seems to be helpful. And so if we look again, if we go back to the MChat, so obviously there's a lot of things in the MChat that are in this list. And also I've just put the list there of what we would expect to see in an ADOS evaluation. And so a lot of these things are also going to be tested in the ADOS. So yeah, communication, facial expressions, combining eye contact and requesting, asking, showing, things like that. So obviously that makes, it makes us ask ourselves whether using either of these things, MChat or the ADOS or the ADI as well, is it really useful for small children with visual impairment? That's one of the questions. It suggests that there may be adaptations needed of these different tests if you're going to use them with visually impaired children. This is a list of the things that seem to be potentially useful for early detection of ASD in visually impaired children. So some of them we just mentioned in those graphs. So rejecting an adult's offer of play at any age seems to be one of the things that came out of this study. Less joint attention, less social engagement, or less social opening, initiating social interaction, and long moments of play spent in non-social sensory seeking activity. And then around 12 months, it seems to be useful to see if there's less shared joy in social situations or play situations. That might be a sign. And then later on, around 3 to 4 years, a child who's not showing functional play, not showing symbolic play, who's got an increase at that time in atypical language like echolalia and stereotypical language, or an increase in motor stereotypies, but at that age, at 3 to 4 years, that seems to be potentially a sign. So in sort of conclusion of that, the study seems to identify certain behaviors that can be observed at a young age that may be useful for detecting social communication difficulties in visually impaired children. Obviously, such a small cohort that it says conclusion, but it's not really a conclusion. It's just an opening. Really needs to carry on working on that question with a larger cohort, maybe longitudinal study. Anytime that you work with home movies, you've obviously got lots of variability and lots of bias involved in that. It highlights the need for specific tools adapted to the visually impaired population. There are rather some tools, some things that are currently in preparation for to help the differential diagnosis. There is the VISCOS Visual Impairment Social Communication Observation Scale, which was almost finished, I think, and we're kind of waiting for it to come out. Not quite sure where it is. And the second one there, social communication interview for young children with visual impairment. Sorry. So as I understand it, with these two scales here, the VISCOS was a little bit like the ADOS, but adapted to visual impairment, and the SOCIVI was a little bit like the ADI assessment, adapted to visual impairment again. What is available right now, there is the OICID, exactly know how you say it, Observation of Autism in People with Sensory and Intellectual Disabilities. So that's available now. It's for the group of people that have visual impairment, but also learning disabilities. Oops. Also available, the TITSA, the test for blind children with ASD or other disabilities. So a functional assessment of blind children, which is not originally designed as a diagnosis tool. It's more of a functional tool to adapt the aims for that child, the objectives. Cognitive, sensory, and communication skills are assessed. The child's competencies, skills, and difficulties to aim to get realistic aims for that child. The TITSA has not been standardized, but has been validated by a scientific committee of experts. About the adaptation of existing tools. It's noted by Gentas and Terrell that some tools have been specifically developed for the assessment of certain aspects in visually impaired children, but the standardization and validity of these tests may be criticized. Tests that exist already for non-visually impaired people. One of the tests that's been studied is the Vineland. There's an article from 2016 where it suggests that, for example, almost 30% of the socialization questions are linked to visual capacities. The ADI can be used if you adapt it a little bit to the visual impairment, the visually impaired population. The use of the ADI is discussed by Corinne Fitzpatrick, with some addressing of the problems of interpretation. Oops, sorry. If you look at the ADOS, we saw earlier that a lot of the ADOS things, the ADOS, the list of things that they're going to look at, can be affected by a visual impairment. Some of the toys and some of the materials, some of the situations are not really adapted to visual impairment. Like, for example, in joint attention, you're meant to say look and point, and there's some imitation situations that obviously going to put a visual impaired child in a little bit of difficulty. Several teams have proposed changes to the materials. I know there's a great some great work done by the team in Ireland, by Corinne and Fitzpatrick, Child Vision Dublin. There's I know that Synodia in Leon have adapted some of the materials as well. A lot of it is sort of trial and error as well, just trying to say, okay, we can't test imitation just visually because the child can't see. How can we test if a child can imitate? So it's, you know, just taking a competency that you want to test and just saying, okay, what material and what situation can we use to make sure that we're as close as possible to be testing the same thing. And so I know there's a lot of different pockets of work being done on that around the world. Jutley was another author that's tried to adapt the ADOS as well. There's no consensus as yet for the true adaptation of the ADOS for visually impaired children. And it's always good to bear in mind that, you know, when you're interpreting the results, a positive quotation on the ADOS does not always equal an ASD diagnosis. So it's always like looking at the big picture, you know, and I'm sure that everybody, all the teams that work on diagnosis do that. You're not just going to use the ADOS, but you've also got like a speech and language assessment and all different tests that you're going to be doing with the child. So you don't just use the ADOS, obviously. And obviously, like classical tests like the WISC, you can use like the verbal subtests of the WISC, but some of the questions are quite frankly biased against visually impaired children. I remember once going through this with a blind teenager, and one of the words they have to define is the word transparent, which is kind of like a bit mean to give that question to a blind child. He actually did quite well, I think. So let's just get to the end of my presentation. And so I just listed a few of the research questions, or the questions that this brings about. So obviously the questions on the underlying issues is like, is there really a special link between autism and visual impairment? Does visual impairment cause some kind of autism, especially congenital blindness? You know, there's a paper by Jur in 2019 that suggests that maybe if you don't have the visual input for the first few years of life, then it leads to different brain changes, which link to superior colliculus. But you can always say, well, yes, but not 100% of visually impaired children have ASD. So, you can always kind of challenge that. And then clinical questions that people often are asking themselves, like, what does autism spectrum disorder look like in children and adults with VI during the early years, during teenage years? What does it look like? Does it look the same as ASD in children who are sighted? How can a diagnosis be reliably made? What assessments can we use? Can a formal protocol be agreed on? What adaptations can be made to the gold standard tests? What specific tests could be imagined? Should an ASD diagnosis in the VI child always be considered temporary? And how should care and educational intervention be adapted to children with this complex profile? What techniques can you take from autism interventions? What techniques can you take from VI programs? And so I'll be able to take some questions, or we'll be able to discuss in a minute, I think. But just to get to this last slide, what next? This was mentioned at the meeting last time in Vienna, that our team in ERSEM Lyon would like to propose a collaborative project within the ENVITER network for those who would be interested, to the aim to gather information within different countries, within different services that work with young visually impaired children, and to exchange professional practice. We would, because that was the big question in Vienna, we have decided that we would like to focus on early years, so children aged 2 to 5, or maybe 2 to 6. We're going to send out a questionnaire this week to try and evaluate, to gauge what people's needs and expectations are of such a project. Well, first of all, to see if anybody is interested in that, to see who might be interested, and then to see what people would expect, what people would be wanting to get out of that kind of project. And then we will be running an online meeting mid-December for the people who are definitely interested. And obviously, if this takes off, there will be an Erasmus project application, which will need to be ready for March 2024. Okay. So thank you for listening to me. I'm just going to share. I don't know how to unshare.
You have, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, on the top you have a green saying something like stop sharing.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't use Zoom very often.
Okay, thank you so much, Laura. It was very interesting. Like, I also had the privilege to watch your presentation in Vienna. So now for all the participants, I think we still have some time left. If you want to ask some questions to Laura, or if you want to suggest something, I would ask you to please raise your virtual hand using the reaction on the bottom of your screen, or using your keyboard. You can also raise your hand by pressing Alt+Y. Okay? So if you want to ask something, please, it's your turn. Our participants can talk with Laura. Anyone? Okay, no raising hands. Again, thank you all so much for being here, and thank you, Laura, for your presentation and for sharing your knowledge about this subject with us. So to all of you, in a few days, I will send a link for a questionnaire for you to be able to give us your feedback about this webinar. And also a link for the recording of this webinar. You can send it to your colleagues or someone that you think it will be interested in watching this webinar. So again, thank you all.
I just wanted to say, somebody on the questions has said, can we get the presentation on email? I think, so Vera, you have it, right?
Yes, I will send the presentation along with the information about the YouTube channel, and also with the questionnaire for the feedback. Okay, so thank you so much. Bye all.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, Laura.
Bye.
Merci beaucoup. Bye.